Good afternoon. My name is Damian Petty. I'm with Leavitt Recreation Insurance. We insure RV parks and campgrounds all over the country. We're the largest writer in the country of them. And we work with all kinds of different campgrounds, from independent campground owners to KOAs, Yogi Bears, National Forest campgrounds. We do a lot of different glamping resorts, glamping operations, and look forward to providing you some good information here. We're going to continue to have more and more of these on different topics of insurance. But what we're talking about today are the different types of insurance that maybe you would like to have, or what you probably should have if you own an RV park or a resort. We want to provide you with as much information as possible, but not go for too long. So this is just going to take two topics out of several, and we'll do a few more additional seminars here in the near future. But the types of insurance that you might want to consider if you have an RV park or a campground is workers' compensation. This is something that would cover your employees if they were to be hurt. Employers' practice insurance is the coverage for sexual harassment, wrongful termination, wrongful hire, discrimination, etc. You also would probably want to have property insurance. This is your fire, wind, hail, lightning, vandalism to your structures. Liability insurance is going to be the trip and falls, slip and falls. If somebody was to sue you or you were to cause property damage to them, that would fall under your liability policy. The inland marine section is going to cover your tractors, lawnmowers, normally self-propelled vehicles that are not necessarily licensed for road use. So if they're not a registered vehicle, then they fall underneath the inland marine. Could also be other things underneath this. Could be your boats, could be boat trailers, that type of stuff that maybe are used there on the campground. Could also be pedestals, picnic tables, light standards, media boxes, TV antennas. If the underwriter wouldn't allow that to be under the property section, then you would put it under the inland marine as a scheduled item. The other section that you might want definitely is a commercial auto policy. A commercial auto policy would cover you for any vehicle that you're using for business use. We want to make sure that if you have a truck and you're running to Home Depot, or you're going to the RV convention or the KOA convention or something along those lines, that you have the proper liability coverage, physical damage coverage as well. But a lot of campgrounds have vehicles that they're using, and you should definitely have a commercial auto policy in place for that. The umbrella or excess limit is definitely something that is becoming more of an issue. Most of the franchises out there require people to have an umbrella. And then the question is how much is enough? So most base policies are $1 million starting, and then you would have $1 million in addition. We want to make sure that that limit is sufficient. The problem is we never know what could happen and how many people could be injured and who could end up suing you and why they would be suing you. So this is kind of a crystal ball type of question. So normally we're going to default to what's your asset levels. If you're worth $2 or $3 million, you should have a limit of $2 or $3 million. But typically what we're seeing lawsuits settling for would be just around $1 million, maybe a little bit more. We had several this last year. 1.3, 1.4, 1.5. It's not to say that you couldn't have a $4.5 million lawsuit, and it's not to say that majority of them don't settle for 2, 3, 4, 500,000 either. So again, we would recommend at least looking at the premium and seeing if that's something that you would be interested in and making an educated decision versus just willy-nilly making a decision. Professional coverage. A lot of RV parks nowadays are doing deeded lots. So they're selling the actual lots within their RV park. And at that point, you potentially have a real estate errors and omissions exposure. You would potentially want to have an errors and omissions policy if you have real estate agents. A lot of deeded lot parks actually have licensed realtors that are there. They might work for a different brokerage firm and not necessarily an employee of the campground. So if that's the case, then they should be providing you proof of insurance before they come onto the property to sell the pieces of property. You also might find a need for directors and officers coverage, or we call it D&O for short. Directors and officers coverage would be for anybody that has a board of directors or a corporation with a board of directors, and it covers the financial decisions that that board is making on behalf of the organization. The other coverage that you might be interested in would be cyber coverage. Cyber coverage would cover you for things like somebody hacking into your system and stealing your employee records, social security numbers, date of birth, that type of stuff. Some people collect credit card information, keep it saved on their computers so that when people come back as repeat customers, they have it on file. It's easy to do a reservation. So if you have that information stored and that was to then be stolen, at that point, you would want to definitely have cyber liability protection. You also might have exposure just taking the credit card and swiping it, and that merchant that you're using for that credit card company pushes back that liability on you if somebody was to somehow hack in and steal that information. So we want to make sure that if you have those exposures, that you're buying the proper insurance. And again, all of these are options. All of these are things that we have to look at on a case-by-case basis and see if it fits for you. But today, we're just going to concentrate on the workers' compensation and then the employer's practice liability. So workers' compensation, who needs it? Typically, I would argue that you probably, if you're in business, you probably have employees of some sort that are doing work on behalf of you. So if you have employees that are doing work on behalf of you, they potentially could get hurt. And if they get hurt, they're going to come back looking for you to pay for their medical. So almost everybody needs it unless you, the business owner, are the only people that actually do the work at the actual campground. And at that point, if that's the case, that's a pretty small campground. However, if you have just one employee, I would buy workman's comp for that one employee. It is going to be based off the payroll that you pay them, and we charge based off of every $100. And that's where, if you compensate somebody a site and that's worth $400 and then you're paying them additional cash, then you would take all that into consideration, and that's what you would report to us to get your work comp policy. Combination of is fine. If it's all compensation, like trade for a site, that's fine too. We just want to make sure that we're calculating all of that into the payroll so that at the time of an audit, our numbers are as accurate as possible. It's not based off of a per employee situation. It's going to be based off your annual payroll. So a lot of us are seasonal type resorts or seasonal businesses. And with that being said, you might have people coming and going throughout the year. At the end of the year, we're just going to do a grand total, and then we're going to apply the rate, and that's how you're going to come up with your premium. A lot of campgrounds have what we call work campers. Those people are doing work on behalf of you, so those work campers need to be covered by a work comp policy. A lot of people think that a work camper is maybe an independent contractor, and typically they are not. Normally, they do not have their own business insurance. They do not have their own business license. They're not providing you a certificate of insurance proving that they have insurance for themselves and their business. They're not doing business for other people. They're not setting their own schedule. They're not doing the work whenever they feel and how they feel. They normally are at your direction doing that job, and therefore they're not independent contractors. So a lot of times we hear in the industry terminology like it's a 1099 employee. 1099 references subcontractors, not employees. So again, we just want to make sure that people are on the right page. Last thing you want to be is in a state like California where you're required to have work comp no matter how many employees you have, or if you only have one employee, you're required to have work comp. And they find out that the employee gets hurt. Now they come back and penalize you. And the penalty in California is like $100,000 potentially and up to a year in jail. Now, contrast, let's go to Texas, where Texas, they do not require you to have work comp at all. Or Missouri, where you have to have 5 employees before you're required to have work comp. However, if those employees get hurt at work, you still potentially are liable for those injuries. So even if it's a minor, hey, I broke my finger, I fell off the ladder, I strained my back, I slipped and fell on the ice and broke my arm or my wrist, or I sprained something, all of those medical expenses now fall in your lap to take care of for that employee. So it's very advisable to have a work comp policy that would be able to pay for that. Never mind if it's a fraudulent type claim where somebody is claiming that they got hurt and now you're having to pay that out of pocket and take care of that yourself. And if you don't have the resources to prove otherwise, or even have an investigator track that person 2, 3, 4 years down the road, that's where that kind of works against you versus just paying the premium. If the insurance company feels that it's fraudulent, they potentially could do investigations, look into it, and maybe track that person down in a year or two and have evidence that they didn't actually get hurt. So lots of reasons why you might want to carry workman's compensation. One of the other things that you can do is opt to include yourself as an owner. I would highly recommend that you do include yourself. A lot of times campground owners are husband-wife ownership. So wife is internal, normally maybe doing accounting, and the husband is out on the campground doing the repairs to the campground. I would say that that person is definitely at a higher risk out in the campground. He can smash his finger with the hammer just as easy as the next guy can. He can fall off the ladder. Heaven forbid, we have had situations where owners have passed away in like a septic tank cleaning it out. Those are the horror stories that you hear and you just sit there and go, holy cow, if they didn't have work comp, how is the spouse, how is the other partners going to be able to pay to have other employees maybe come in, the loss of income. There's just a lot of things there that would be a reason why you would want to have work comp as an owner. A lot of states, they're going to have a minimum payroll for an owner. So like in Colorado, for example, no matter how much you pay yourself, if it is less than $52,000, they're going to rate you like you're paying yourself $52,000 per person. Where in contrast, in Montana, they only use $10,400 per year. So the insurance in Montana is going to be way less for the exact same coverage. We want to make sure that you are making an educated guess, or an educated decision, I should say, when looking at these as options for you. Get the quote, look at the numbers, and see if it makes sense. We see a lot of times where owners could definitely get hurt, and it would be really advantageous for them to have the coverage. Kind of alluded already to, is it required? In a lot of states, it is required. A lot of states have like minimum number. Again, the way I look at it is, even if you are, required to have it only after having a certain number of employees, let's say 5 employees, to me, they're just giving you enough rope to hang yourself. And that's where we want to avoid that. For the few $1,000s a year that it might cost to have insurance on those employees, I think it's well worth that as an option. If you have any questions on this, please give me a call, follow up with us. We do have an exclusive program with a carrier. The rates have been really competitive, and little by little, we're seeing some really good results. And with that, the rates keep coming down. So give us a call, let us know what we can do for you, and then we'll go from there. The next coverage is the employer's practice liability. Definitely something that is newer in this industry in probably the last 2 to 3 years. I've been doing this for 22 years. We hardly ever saw anybody buying employer's practice liability insurance even 5 years ago, and that has drastically changed. The Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matters movement has probably triggered a lot more of the coverage. Employees are becoming more and more knowledgeable of what an employer has to do. They can easily Google stuff and find out, hey, you can't do that, and therefore then we have a lawsuit coming down the pipeline. But typically the employer's practice liability insurance is going to cover you for things like sexual harassment, wrongful termination, wrongful hire, and discrimination. So sexual harassment is pretty self-explanatory. However, we want to make sure that as part of your policy that you have, in your employee handbook is that you have a no tolerance policy, and how would that be handled if there was a situation. At the same time, wrongful termination. Do you have an at-will statement in your employment agreement? Are you in a state that allows you to do that? Or do you have to give warning before you terminate somebody? Where this became an issue this year with COVID was that a lot of employers were getting rid of employees. Maybe it's a layoff, maybe it's a furlough, or just outright just terminating people. And a lot of those employees have now turned around and sued their employers for those things. And we're seeing a lot of claims come up in that. Typically, we in the resort business are seasonal. So at the end of the season, we might say goodbye to one of our employees, and we normally don't have a huge issue with this. But this is something that is obviously out there. It does happen. There are a lot of resorts that operate year round, so they have maybe a little bit more exposure than a seasonal operation does. But discrimination has also been one that we've seen in the last few years poke its ugly head, where we'll see somebody suing somebody for having a website that's not ADA compliant. So that's where you sit there and go, holy cow, I didn't even know I needed to have a website that was ADA compliant or accessible. And at that point, you get a lawsuit. So who's going to defend you in that regard? That's where this policy would come into play and have defense coverage for you. It doesn't fix the problem. It doesn't fix your website. If it was a discrimination lawsuit, let's say ADA related on your premises, you didn't have a handicap ramp, or you didn't have a handicap lift into the pool or the hot tub, or your bathrooms weren't accessible, or your laundry room wasn't accessible. It's not going to pay to fix those types of things, but it would provide you the defense. If there's any civil penalties, it also does not cover that. So one of the things with this is it's a great way, because you never know when you're going to need it. And instead of having to pay that attorney cost out of your pocket all in one fell swoop, you can turn to your insurance policy and you can budget for having that policy in place. Right now, most employers' practice liability policies run about $1,500. Depends on the size, depends on how many employees you have. But we see pretty typically 1 to 10 employees is about $1,000 to $1,500. If you're a bigger operation and have more employees, it obviously can go up from there. But hopefully this is helpful information. These are two particular types of policies that I would highly recommend at least looking into and considering. Nobody requires them of you, like the employer's practice. Nobody requires you to have that type of policy. So with that being said, a lot of times it's forgotten and we don't think about asking for it. We want to make sure that we're providing you good advice. If you have any questions on any of the other topics that I started with, please feel free to reach out and give me a call or reach out to Leavitt in general, and we would be delighted to answer any of your questions. Thank you again. Have a great day, and look forward to talking to you on the next subject.